Most people think the emotionally distant partner is the dangerous one. The one who pulls away, shuts down, disappears for days, and acts like they don't care. They think that person holds all the power. But the truth is far more unsettling. The truly dangerous one is not the person who never cared deeply. The truly dangerous one is the person who cared so deeply that they reached a point where they simply stopped. When an empath gets fed up, something irreversible happens. There is no drama, no yelling, no dramatic breakup scene. There is just a quiet emotional death. And by the time you notice it, it is already too late. An empath is not weak. They are not naive. They are not blind. They are deeply perceptive, emotionally intuitive, and profoundly connected to the emotional world of others. They feel everything. They sense shifts in energy, tone, behavior, and intention long before words are spoken. They see wounds in others and feel compelled to heal them. They give chances not because they don't see the red flags, but because they believe in growth, in love, in potential. They stay when most would walk away, and they forgive when most would cut off contact. They carry hope like a sacred promise, believing that if they love hard enough, something inside the other person will awaken. In relationships, empaths often become the emotional backbone. They listen, they validate, they nurture, they support. They carry conversations, they hold space, they remember important details, they feel responsible for emotional harmony. They are the ones who apologize first, who reflect, who try to understand the other person's perspective even when they are hurt. They see beyond behavior and into the pain that created it. And because of that, they tolerate more emotional neglect, more inconsistency, more emotional push-pull than they ever should. On the other side, the emotionally avoidant partner appears powerful. They seem independent, detached, unbothered. They don't chase. They don't cling. They don't express vulnerability easily. When conflict arises, they withdraw. When intimacy grows, they pull back. When emotions deepen, they shut down. To the empath, this feels like a puzzle, a challenge, a wound to heal. To the avoidant, this feels like control. Their distance gives them leverage. Their silence creates anxiety. Their unpredictability keeps the empath emotionally invested, constantly trying to reconnect. Avoidants often believe that their emotional detachment gives them power. They think the person who cares less controls the relationship, and for a while that may appear true. The empath adapts, compromises, overextends. They try to communicate more clearly, love more gently, give more space, be more patient. They internalize the emotional distance as something they must fix. They carry the emotional labor of the relationship while the avoidant benefits from connection without fully engaging in it. But what the avoidant rarely understands is that the empath is not infinite. Their love is deep, but it is not endless. Their patience is strong, but it is not eternal. Their empathy is powerful, but it is not self-destructive forever. At some point, the empath reaches a threshold where self-awareness overrides hope, where exhaustion overrides attachment, where clarity overrides fantasy. The empath does not break suddenly. They break quietly. They notice the patterns, the cycles of closeness and distance, the apologies that change nothing, the promises that dissolve, the moments of vulnerability that never deepen into consistency. They feel the loneliness of being emotionally present with someone who is emotionally absent. They feel the weight of carrying the relationship alone. They feel their own needs shrinking to make space for someone else's avoidance. And slowly, something shifts. The empath stops romanticizing the pain. They stop justifying the neglect. They stop believing that love should feel like abandonment. They stop waiting for potential and start seeing reality. This is the moment most avoidants never see coming, because the empath does not announce this shift. They do not threaten. They do not manipulate. They simply start to withdraw emotionally in a way that is not reactive, but final. When an empath gets fed up, Their detachment is not cold, it is clear, it is grounded, it is not driven by fear or avoidance. It is driven by self-respect, and that is what makes it dangerous. Avoidants are predictable in their distancing. Empaths, when done, are unpredictable because they don't play emotional games. They don't push and pull. They don't test. They don't seek control. They simply release. This is why a fed-up empath is more dangerous than an avoidant. The avoidant distances as a defense. The empath detaches as a decision. One is driven by fear of intimacy. The other is driven by awakening, and awakening does not reverse. The empath's breaking point is not dramatic. It is quiet and deeply internal. It often happens after countless conversations, reflections, tears, and self-questioning. It happens when they realize they are pouring into a container that cannot hold their love. It happens when they feel themselves shrinking to maintain connection. It happens when they realize that staying is betraying themselves. In that moment, something profound happens. The empath stops chasing clarity and becomes clarity. They stop seeking validation and become validation. They stop waiting for someone to choose them and choose themselves. And once that shift occurs, the emotional bond they had with the avoidant begins to dissolve, not with anger, but with understanding. This is what terrifies avoidants the most, even if they never consciously admit it. They are accustomed to being pursued, to being emotionally central, to being the one who pulls away while the other tries to pull them back. But when the empath stops trying, stops reacting, stops caring in the same way, the dynamic collapses. The power structure reverses, and suddenly the avoidant feels the emptiness they created. A fed-up empath does not argue. They do not beg. They do not explain endlessly. They do not seek closure from someone who cannot give it. They simply disengage. And their disengagement is not loud. It is subtle. It is in the lack of emotional reactions, the lack of long messages, the lack of emotional availability, the lack of hope. To the avoidant, this feels unsettling. Because the empath was the emotional constant, the empath was the safety net. The empath was the source of connection. And now, that source is gone. Not in a dramatic explosion, but in a calm, steady withdrawal that cannot be reversed with breadcrumbs or mixed signals. This is why a fed-up empath is more dangerous than an avoidant. Not because they seek revenge, not because they manipulate, not because they want to hurt anyone, but because when they leave completely. And when they detach in a way that transforms them permanently. The avoidant may come and go, cycle through connections, repeat patterns, but the empath who reaches their breaking point does not repeat the same lesson. They integrate it, they grow from it, they recalibrate their standards, they become emotionally unavailable to emotional unavailability, and that is the ultimate shift. If you are an empath listening to this, you may recognize this exhaustion. The quiet realization that love should not feel like abandonment, the slow detachment that feels less like heartbreak and more like waking up. And if you are avoidant, this may be the moment you realize that the person who cared the most was also the person who would leave the most completely once they understood their worth. This is only the beginning of the story of what happens when an empath gets fed up, and why their silence, their detachment, and their self-choosing is far more powerful than any emotional withdrawal ever could be. When an empath reaches the point of emotional detachment, it does not look like the cold shutdown people imagine. It looks calm, it looks peaceful, it looks like clarity. And that is what makes it so powerful and so final. Unlike the avoidant, who distances to protect themselves from vulnerability, the empath distances to protect their soul. This is not a reaction. This is a resolution. The empath's detachment is not impulsive. It is the result of countless nights replaying conversations, analyzing patterns, feeling the weight of unmet needs, and slowly realizing that love cannot be forced into someone who is not emotionally available. It is the slow erosion of hope. It is the realization that staying is more painful than leaving. It is the internal shift from "how can I make this work" to "why am I the only one trying?" This is the moment where the empath becomes emotionally unpredictable to the avoidant. Avoidants are used to a pattern. They pull away, and the other person pursues. They go silent, and the other person reaches out. They create distance, and the other person tries to close it. This dynamic gives them a sense of control, even if it is unconscious. But when the empath stops playing this role, the entire system collapses. The empath does not chase when they are done. They do not confront with intensity. They do not plead. They simply step back. Their energy shifts. Their emotional availability diminishes. Their responses become neutral. Their attachment dissolves. They no longer feel the urge to explain, to justify, to fix. They no longer feel the emotional charge that once kept them bonded. And to the avoidant, this feels like losing gravity. The empath's disappearing act is not dramatic. There is no theatrical goodbye. There is no emotional storm. There is just a quiet absence. They stop initiating conversations. They stop sharing their inner world. They stop seeking emotional closeness. They stop reacting to the avoidance push-pull. They stop being emotionally accessible. They become present in their own life again. And this disappearance is not physical at first. It is emotional. They can be in the same space, the same conversation, the same relationship, but something is gone. The warmth, the emotional depth, the sense of connection. The empath becomes a version of themselves that is self-contained, no longer intertwined. And this is what confuses and unsettles the avoidants often believe they are the ones who control closeness. They believe they can return when they want connection and withdraw when they feel overwhelmed. But when the empath stops caring, stops responding, stops engaging emotionally, the avoidant feels something unfamiliar: loss of control. The emotional safety they took for granted disappears. The person who once anchored them emotionally is no longer emotionally available. This is often when the avoidant experiences shock. They notice the empath is no longer asking questions, no longer expressing needs, no longer seeking reassurance, no longer reacting to their distance. The empath no longer seems affected by their withdrawal. The avoidant may try to re-engage, to send mixed signals, to test the bond, but the empath's response is different now. It is calm, grounded, and detached. The empath remembers everything, not just events, but emotional patterns. They remember how they felt, waiting for a message, how they felt being emotionally shut out, how they felt minimizing their needs to avoid conflict, how they felt loving someone who could not fully receive that love. They remember the emotional cost, and memory becomes wisdom. Empaths are deeply intuitive. They sense energy shifts, emotional undercurrents, unspoken truths. When they reflect, they see patterns clearly. They see how often they compromised, how often they rationalized neglect, how often they hoped instead of demanded change. This clarity does not come with bitterness. It comes with acceptance, and acceptance dissolves attachment. Once an empath reaches this stage, their boundaries become unbreakable. Before, boundaries may have been flexible, softened by empathy, hope, and love. But now boundaries are rooted in self-respect. They are no longer negotiable. They are no longer bent for potential. They are no longer sacrificed for connection. The empath no longer tolerates emotional inconsistency. They no longer chase emotional unavailability. They no longer romanticize emotional distance. They recognize their worth not as a concept, but as a felt truth. And when someone cannot meet their emotional depth, they do not try to shrink. They simply step away. This is what makes a fed-up empath dangerous in relationships. They do not threaten to leave. They leave internally long before they leave physically. And when they finally walk away, there is no emotional cord to pull them back, no breadcrumb to lure them in, no apology to reopen the wound. They are done, not out of anger, but out of clarity. For the avoidant, this is often when regret begins. Not the dramatic regret of heartbreak movies, but a quiet realization that they lost something rare. They lost someone who saw them deeply, who held space for their wounds, who loved them without conditions, who stayed when it was difficult, and now that presence is gone. The avoidant may replay memories, the empath's patience, the empath's warmth, the empath's understanding, the empath's emotional depth, and they may realize that what they perceived as pressure was actually intimacy, and what they perceived as suffocation was actually connection. But by the time this realization arrives, the empath is already gone. A fed-up empath does not return to emotional deserts. They do not revisit relationships that required them to abandon themselves. They do not reopen doors that led to self-betrayal. Their love evolves, their standards rise, their emotional availability becomes selective. If you are an empath, this stage can feel both liberating and painful. Liberating because you feel your power returning. Painful because you realize how much you gave to someone who could not fully meet you. But this pain is not destructive. It is transformative. It turns empathy inward. It turns love into self-love. It turns attachment into wisdom. If you are avoidant, this stage can feel disorienting. You may feel the loss more deeply than you expected. You may feel the absence more intensely than the presence ever felt. You may realize that emotional distance is not the same as independence, and emotional closeness is not the same as loss of freedom. But growth often begins with loss. The story of a fed-up empath is not a story of revenge. It is a story of awakening. It is the moment someone who gave too much learns to give to themselves. It is the moment love stops being self-sacrifice and becomes self-respect. And once this transformation happens, the empath becomes emotionally unreachable to patterns that once controlled them. This is why their detachment is more dangerous than any avoidant withdrawal, because it is not fear-driven, it is not reactive, it is not temporary. It is rooted in self-awareness, and self-awareness does not go backward. And this is only the middle of the transformation. The empath who has detached is just beginning to step into a new version of themselves, one that the avoidant will recognize only when it is too late. When an empath reaches this stage of detachment, something inside them hardens into something sacred. Their boundaries stop being emotional suggestions and become non-negotiable laws of self-respect. Before, they might have said, "I need this," while secretly preparing themselves to compromise. Now they say, "This is who I am, this is what I require, and this is what I will not tolerate." And they mean it in a way that is not loud, not aggressive, but immovable. These boundaries are not built from ego. They are built from grief, reflection, and awakening. The empath remembers the nights they felt unseen, the conversations where they felt the moments where they felt too much, too sensitive, too emotional, too demanding, when in reality they were simply human. Their boundaries are carved from the realization that love should not require self-erasure. Once an empath sets these boundaries, they do not test them, they do not threaten to enforce them. They simply live by them, and this is what shocks avoidance the most. The empath who once tolerated emotional inconsistencies now walks away from it without hesitation. The empath who once waited now moves on without explanation. The empath who once chased now refuses to pursue anyone who cannot meet them halfway. This is also why a fed-up empath rarely comes back. When they leave not just the person, but the version of themselves who tolerated less than they deserved. Returning would mean betraying their own growth, and growth is sacred to an empath. They are not afraid of loneliness. They are afraid of losing themselves again. The empath understands that love without reciprocity is not love. It is self-sacrifice. They understand that emotional availability is not a gift to be begged for, but a baseline requirement. They understand that connection without consistency is chaos. And once they internalize these truths, there is no emotional path back to the same dynamic. This is often when the avoidant enters a phase of regret. It is not always immediate. Avoidants often feel relief when someone stops demanding closeness. They may feel freer, lighter, less pressured. But over time, something unsettling happens. The space they once craved becomes emptiness. The silence they once enjoyed becomes loneliness. The absence they once controlled becomes abandonment. They may notice that no one else connects with them in the same way. No one else sees through their defenses with compassion. No one else holds their emotional world with such gentleness. They may realize that the empath's patience was not weakness, but depth, that their understanding was not naivete, but emotional intelligence, that their love was not suffocation, but presence. This realization can be painful. It can feel like grief. They may replay conversations, moments of closeness, opportunities they dismissed. They may wonder why they couldn't open up, why they pushed away what they secretly desired. But avoidant regret is often silent, internal, and delayed. And by the time it surfaces, the empath has moved into a different emotional dimension. The empath's energy shifts dramatically after detachment. They stop pouring into others and start pouring into themselves. They rediscover passions, creativity, friendships, purpose. They reconnect with their intuition, their body, their spirituality. They become emotionally centered rather than emotionally scattered. This shift is magnetic. The empath becomes calmer, clearer, more grounded. They are no longer seeking validation. They are no longer over-explaining. They are no longer tolerating crumbs. They are selective, discerning, and deeply connected to their inner world. They attract differently. They love differently. They exist differently. For the avoidant, this version of the empath can feel unreachable. The person who once tried so hard to connect now seems distant, composed, and uninterested in emotional games. The empath no longer reacts to mixed signals. They no longer feel triggered by emotional distance. They no longer chase clarity from someone who cannot give it. This is the silent consequence of taking an empath for granted. The emotional availability that once flowed freely is now protected. The vulnerability that once felt safe is now guarded. The connection that once felt guaranteed is now selective. And this transformation is irreversible. Avoidants often fear being engulfed by intimacy, but they rarely consider the terror of being left by someone who loved deeply. The empath's departure is not chaotic. It is surgical. It cuts the emotional cord cleanly. And the absence is felt in the quiet moments, in the lack of emotional resonance, in the realization that something irreplaceable was lost. If you are an empath, this part of the journey can feel lonely. You may feel misunderstood. You may feel emotionally distant from people who once felt central. You may grieve the version of yourself who loved unconditionally. But this grief is a rite of passage. It is the shedding of self-abandonment. It is the birth of self-loyalty. If you are avoidant, this part of the journey can feel haunting. You may feel the absence of someone who saw you beyond your defenses. You may feel the echo of their presence long after they are gone. You may realize that emotional detachment is not freedom. It is isolation, and emotional connection is not a cage. It is home. The fed-up empath is dangerous not because they hurt others, but because they stop hurting themselves. They stop bending. They stop waiting. They stop explaining. They stop loving people who cannot love them back in the same language. And this self-loyalty changes everything. Their silence is not punishment. Their distance is not manipulation. Their absence is not revenge. It is alignment. It is the natural consequence of self-awareness meeting emotional truth. And once this alignment happens, the empath cannot unsee what they have seen. This is why the empath who has reached their limit is more dangerous than the avoidant. Because the avoidant's distance is a shield. The empath's distance is a boundary. And boundaries, once embodied, redefine every relationship that follows. And this is not the end of the story. The empath who has awakened to their worth is about to step into a version of themselves that changes how they love, how they choose, and how they connect forever. When an empath reaches this stage of transformation, they become emotionally unreachable to patterns that once controlled them. This is not emotional numbness. This is emotional mastery. They can still feel deeply, love deeply, and connect deeply, but only where there is reciprocity, safety, and emotional presence. They no longer chase love. They no longer fear abandonment. They no longer confuse intensity with intimacy. They have learned the difference between connection and trauma bonding, between attachment and alignment, between chemistry and compatibility. This version of the empath is often misunderstood. People may call them cold, distant, or guarded, but the truth is, they are simply discerning. They no longer open their heart by default. They open it by design. They listen to intuition. They honor their nervous system. They trust the subtle discomfort that once whispered, but was ignored. They choose peace over potential. They choose stability over chaos. They choose themselves without guilt. To someone who once benefited from their unconditional love, this transformation can feel like loss, rejection, or even punishment. But it is none of those things. It is evolution. It is what happens when someone who loved too much learns to love wisely. It is what happens when empathy turns inward and becomes self-respect. This is why a fed-up empath is more dangerous in love than an avoidant. Not because they manipulate, not because they dominate, but because they cannot be controlled by emotional distance anymore. They cannot be hooked by inconsistency. They cannot be pulled back by nostalgia, apologies, or temporary vulnerability. They see patterns, they recognize cycles, and they refuse to repeat them. The empath who has awakened becomes emotionally sovereign. They are no longer defined by how much they can endure. They are defined by how clearly they can choose. They no longer measure love by sacrifice. They measure love by mutuality. They no longer equate pain with depth. They equate peace with alignment. For the avoidant, this is often when the lesson arrives too late. They may finally feel the desire for closeness, for vulnerability, for real connection. They may finally recognize that the empath's love was not pressure, but presence. That their emotional needs were not demands, but invitations. That their patience was not weakness, but emotional maturity. But timing matters in love, and emotional growth cannot be retroactive. The avoidant may carry this lesson into future relationships. They may become more aware, more open, more willing to connect. But the person who taught them this lesson is often no longer available. The empath has moved on, not out of bitterness, but out of alignment. And this is the quiet tragedy of avoidant dynamics. The love that could have healed arrives before the person is ready to receive it. If you are an empath, understand this. Your capacity to love is not your weakness. Your empathy is not your flaw. Your depth is not your burden. The only danger was loving without boundaries. And once you learn to love with boundaries, your empathy becomes your superpower. You can still be kind, compassionate, and deeply connected without abandoning yourself. If you are avoidant, understand this. Emotional distance may feel safe, but it also costs intimacy. Avoidance protects you from vulnerability, but it also protects you from love. And while you may not feel the loss immediately, the echo of missed connection can follow you long after the relationship ends. The empath's final message is not spoken. It is embodied. It is in the way they walk away without drama, in the way they detach without cruelty, in the way they love themselves without apology. Their silence is not empty, it is full of clarity. Their absence is not cold, it is full of self-respect. Their departure is not revenge, it is rebirth. They no longer chase someone who runs. They no longer shrink to fit someone else's comfort zone. They no longer negotiate their worth for connection. They stand in their emotional truth, grounded, present, and whole. And from that place, they choose relationships that feel safe, mutual, and emotionally alive. This is why a fed-up empath is more dangerous than an avoidant, because once they are done, they are done. Not with love, not with connection, not with intimacy, but with patterns that required self-betrayal. They leave not to hurt, but to heal. They detach not to punish, but to align. They choose themselves not out of selfishness, but out of survival and awakening. And if you are listening to this and recognizing yourself in these words, know this: your detachment is not a failure. It is a graduation. Your boundaries are not walls, they are gates. Your silence is not emptiness, it is peace. And your journey from overgiving to self-honoring is not the end of love, it is the beginning of conscious love. The empath, who has had enough, does not destroy relationships. They end illusions. They do not become heartless. They become heart-wise. They do not stop loving. They stop bleeding. And in doing so, they become the most powerful, grounded, and emotionally sovereign version of themselves. And that is something no avoidant, no matter how distant, can ever control again.